Thank you. Spurgeon's College in the Cold War. That's the title that I thought about for this lecture and rejected. What on earth could I be thinking about? Well, in the 1960s, some Baptist students, in fact quite mature men, came from the Soviet Union to study in this building, and they were controversial. Were they refugees from the terrible religious persecution which was going on in the Soviet Union at the time, but which they did not say much about? Or were they hand-selected by the church, but with the approval of the Soviet government, to give an impression that there was religious liberty in the Soviet Union when in fact there was persecution? I'm not going to develop that line of argument at the moment, least of all to discuss or even pass judgment on those students, but it would be a very interesting study to carry out, to look at exactly who was here when, what their subsequent careers consisted of when they went back to the Soviet Union. They did all, by the way, go back. As far as I know, none of them defected to the West, although some did in America in later years. But I'm going to talk not about the Russian Baptists today, although I shall mention them. I'm going to talk primarily about the Russian Orthodox Church and look back over some of the historical developments which have led us to where we are today, and where we are in 2014 is a controversial situation. Yes, I'm not wired up to anything. Those of you who have looked up, because I asked you might look at this in your reading preparation for this lecture, you will have seen the article, perhaps read it, I hope, Putin, the Patriarch and the Russian Public, in the latest issue of the Keston newsletter. I don't know whether online you got this most magnificent photograph of, you can't quite see it from where you are at the back, but there is the Patriarch and there is President Putin. And a lot of the controversy about the Russian Orthodox Church today can be extrapolated from that photograph. There are some spare copies here on the shelf, on the table, and there's one copy. There are copies. There are some back numbers as well. So take them all and put them in the library, swap them around, and so on. I think there are 4 back issues, and everybody should be able to receive at least one. The background to what I have to say goes way back, even before the revolution of 1917, and that could form the subject of a whole series of lectures, which obviously there is not time for today. But the essential point that one has to know about the Russian Orthodox Church is that under Lenin, after 1917, and under Stalin, from the late 1920s, especially through the 1930s, the Russian Orthodox Church, in a series of persecutions, wave after wave, was almost eliminated. In fact, as a public voice in Russia, although it had been the symbol, the very symbol of the old Russian state, in the Soviet Union, it not only lost its voice, it lost its liberty, it lost its churches, it lost its clergy, it lost its rights in education, it lost virtually everything. It would not be too much of an overstatement to call the existence of the Russian Orthodox Church by 1941, when the Soviet Union was forced into the war by the invasion of Nazi Germany, it would not be too much of an exaggeration to call it an underground church. Very little above ground was preserved. But out of the tragedy of World War II, when the Soviet Union was to lose millions of men and women fighting on the front, as well as that, the Russian Orthodox Church began to be accepted once again as part of the fabric of the Soviet Union. Why? Because Stalin had eliminated so much opposition, even his own generals in the army, that there was a complete gap in the underpinning of the Soviet state. When the Germans invaded, there was no immediate sign that the Soviet Union would survive under that onslaught. And in his desperation, Stalin called on all sectors of society, including the Russian Orthodox Church, to support the war effort. And the picture that I've just shown you indicates that the Russian Orthodox Church will support the state effort in war and in peace, and has done so at the top level being the official body that controls the life of the Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, which didn't, by the way, exist. It had been abolished in the 1920s and 30s, but it was allowed to re-emerge during the Second World War, and to appoint new bishops, to open some churches. Clergy who'd survived, many had not, but clergy who had survived came back to their parishes, provided they would take an oath of loyalty to the Soviet state. And they began, in a very quiet and modest way, to rebuild the life of the churches in the 1940s. It was a time of great relief to all believers in the Soviet Union, including, of course, to Russian Baptists, who had initially not suffered so badly in the 1920s, but were also, as a public body, more or less eliminated in the 1930s. The Baptists were allowed to open a church in Moscow. The Baptist leadership was eventually, like the Russian Orthodox leadership, encouraged to open up some foreign contacts and so on and so on. So the church that I saw when I got to Moscow in 1959 was a church which had just emerged from a period of persecution, to see something like 15 years at that point of a better life. Christians were still intimidated. Stalin had been dead only 6 years when I arrived in Moscow. But at the same time, some believers began to think that really there was a future for them in the new Soviet Union. The new Soviet Union, which was trying at that time, through the good offices of Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, to show a better face to the world. His shining smile and peasant face, and his natural proclivity to hobnob with American farmers in the Midwest and say how difficult it is to grow grain in a hostile climate, all that sort of thing endeared him to a lot of people. Not, dear friends, to Russian Christians. It was my lot, and I have firmly believed that God's hand was on my shoulder at this point, and that I had been prepared in my life learning Russian and being selected for this first exchange of students, that I was going to be prepared for something new, something unusual, something, as it turned out, to be significant. And that was that the month of my arrival in Moscow, September 59, also saw the outbreak of a new period of anti-religious persecution. I bought off the newsstands in Moscow the very first copy. I did it out of curiosity. I was told it was a new publication talking about what it said on the cover, Science and Religion, Nauka i Religia. But when I opened and began to read this publication, I could see that it was much more than that. In fact, there wasn't much Nauka, science, in it at all. It was more or less an open attack on the church, all churches, all religions, such as had not been seen since the heyday of Stalin's atheism, anti-religious persecution of the 1930s. This was a shock. A shock, not only because, as a Christian, I felt, for my Russian friends, I felt offended that they were again being threatened with all sorts of sanctions. The Science and Religion magazine reported, for example, on the imprisonment of some Russian bishops of the Orthodox Church for financial embezzlement. Lots of things, lots of stories like that. Particular attacks against the Lithuanian Catholics, particular attacks against the Baptists, who by this time had spread and had branches throughout, in every one of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union. During my year, I was not able to find out a very great deal of what lay behind this persecution. The details were dim, and I did not at that time witness churches being closed and so on. But I was to do later on, in 1964, I went back to Moscow preparing to publish my first book, Opium of the People, and my friends took me to a place in Moscow where there had been a church of St. Peter and St. Paul, which had a couple of weeks earlier been blown up, allegedly in order to extend the Russian underground system. Well, the Russian underground system works perfectly well these days with the church on top, because it was rebuilt and reopened last year. There's a lot more I could tell you about that story, perhaps at the end, but I have to move on. I prepared my book having received documents. Samizdat became a big word. Self-publishing. It really means not publishing at all, but circulating manuscripts. Samizdat became important to me. It became important to Russian Christians. It became important to the world. The novels of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, after his first One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was published, very strangely, in 1962, but all the rest of his novels were circulated in samizdat and did not get published in Russia until the 1990s. Well, I received samizdat because by this time some people knew that I was collecting information. This was long before the foundation of Keston College. But people began sending me samizdat, and I received a document describing the persecution of Christians, of monks in a village in Ukraine. And the samizdat talked about the attempts by the local people to counterbalance, to countermand the threatened closure of their monastery. This was the Pachayev Lavra, the Pachayev monastery in Ukraine. And the documents that I received talked about not only the attempted closure of the monastery, but the brutal treatment of the monks. Monks from this monastery were being taken out. There's an account of a 90 years old monk who was taken out and thrown into a psychiatric prison and appallingly treated because he refused to leave the monastery. Then somehow he got back to the monastery. It was still open and never closed, by the way. I think the campaign for its on its behalf in the West did, in the end, secure its long-term future. It never closed. But this 90-year-old monk was eventually thrown out of the monastery again. And even a Ukrainian winter, a bit further south than Moscow, can be quite severe. And he was simply dumped in the forest about 50 kilometers away from the monastery and had to find his own way back to it. He died soon after, but with his head unbowed. That was the sort of information that I began to receive, and I put some of it together into my first book, which also recounted my meetings with Soviet students, their attitudes to religion and so on. What did they think of Lenin and Stalin? And all my conversations, all my experiences went together into a book which was published by Faber and Faber in 1965 called Opium of the People. And it got some reviews, but most importantly, it was serialized in the Church Times. And that serialization gave rise to a furore. Unbeknown to me, the Church Times was being read in Moscow, or more likely it was being read in the Soviet embassy here in London, and they were sending reports back to Moscow. And the book was published in 1965, and early in 1966, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, invited me to come and see him. I was quite surprised to get that out of the blue, and he said, do you know that we have received a letter of complaint against you from the Patriarch of Moscow, Patriarch Alexei I. I was dumbfounded. Of course I didn't know. He said, I will read you an extract from it. Somebody had translated it for him. Or perhaps they wrote it. No, this is my own translation. I think that he had another one. This is what he read to me. In June last year, the newspaper Church Times, which, as you know, plays a significant part. This is the Patriarch writing to the Archbishop. As you know, the Church Times plays a significant part in forming public opinion in the Church of England. It printed 3 extracts from a book published at that time, Opium of the People, by Michael Bourdeaux, a priest of your church. The subject matter of these extracts, consisting of accounts of the author's conversations with people he met by chance during his stay in our country, portrays in a distorted manner our country's attitude to freedom of conscience. It falsifies and misrepresents the position of religion and church life in the USSR. This publication shows a lack of responsibility shown by those in charge of it. And I write this letter to you, Your Grace, in, quote, in the hope that they, the Church Times, will not behave like this again in the future. What a veiled threat. Michael Ramsey, having read me the letter, then had smiles all over his face, and he said, Michael, even if it were in my power to censor the Church Times, I am not about to do so. For the first time in my life, I heard somebody say in authority, continue your work. The only other person who ever said that to me was Pope John Paul II. He said, continue your work, when I met him in the Vatican many years later. Well, continuing my work was what I did, although it took, this was, by the way, the Archbishop and I agreed that the content of this letter would be kept secret. It would not be used as a stick to beat the back of anybody, least of all to sour relations between the great Orthodox Church and the great Anglican Church. So it was a secret very rapidly broken by the Patriarch of Moscow himself, who published it, the original Russian, in the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate. So it became a possession for everybody. My work from the very beginning was looked at with grave suspicion by those in authority in the Soviet Union, not only understandably by an atheist regime, but regrettably by the Russian Orthodox Church in its official capacity, the Moscow Patriarchate, the Moscow Baptist Union, the All-Union Council, and so on and so on. But nevertheless, this outbreak of opposition was one of the factors which persuaded me that something more must be done. So I continued my work by eventually in 1969 establishing the work of what would become Keston College, where we collected all this information. We began to receive great swathes of information to publish from all over the Soviet Union and eventually from other communist countries, especially Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all those countries. They wanted to be, as it were, in on the act, because Keston became the only independent voice speaking for what had been called at one time the Church of Silence, or the persecuted church, in the East Bloc. We published the works of dozens of Christian leaders, and in some cases quite humble Christian voices, men and women who would not, perhaps in normal circumstances, have had their voices heard. But what they did represent was a cry of pain, a cry from within the soul, a cry against this persecution. And it came from all sectors of belief, not only from Christians, but from Muslims, from Jews, from Buddhists, of whom there were quite a number in the Soviet Union. And we established ourselves as an organization which would print, usually without comment, only to verify the accuracy of the sources, print this information and circulate it around the world. Names like Father Gleb Yakunin, Anatoly Devitsin, Alexander Ogorodnikov, Bishop Afanasy, Boris Talantsov, and eventually Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Some of their works appeared first in our publications. But then, moving on, through the 70s and the 80s, which didn't see a great change. It was a kind of frozen conflict, just like in Ukraine at the moment, without that much happening on either side, but certainly no relaxation of persecution until the advent of Mikhail Gorbachev. And people raised the question when he came to power and started talking about a new watchword, perestroika, which means restructuring, or glasnost, which meant openness or letting the voice, glasgolos, a voice, be heard. This was the time when something new seemed to be happening. And I would like to think that we at Keston were the first to acknowledge that the Gorbachev regime was going to mean, was inaugurating a new era of religious liberties, such as it turned out to be. But at first, people were very suspicious of Gorbachev. Was this not another plot to shore up the Communist Party in the Soviet Union? And historical research proves that Gorbachev did indeed intend that to happen. But once he started reform, these things, it grew, and the genie which came out of the bottle could not be pushed back into that bottle. So the Gorbachev era brought a time of great change for the Russian Church. It brought a time when everything improved. I had been at that stage for two periods of 10 years. There was just a very short time in between, in the early 70s, when I could get back to Russia for a couple of short visits. But for 10 years, up to 1988, I had been banned from the Soviet Union. I couldn't get a visa. But then things changed. In April 1988, Gorbachev summoned some of the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church and he read a speech to them which quite clearly gave them the indication that there was a new direction and that the reforms, as far as the church was concerned, were for real. This is what Gorbachev said on the 28th of April, 1988. And I quote the date because it was the very day, the very anniversary of Stalin's law of 1929, which finally nailed the last vestiges of religious liberty in the Soviet Union in a coffin. So the date was symbolical. And this is what Gorbachev, it was a long speech, but a couple of extracts, what he said to the assembled bishops. Not everything has been easy and simple in the sphere of church-state relations. Religious organizations have not been free from being affected by the tragic developments that occurred in the period of the cult of personality. That is symbol. By that he means Stalinism, but he couldn't mention Stalinism at that point. We have made mistakes in regard to the church and believers in the 1930s and the years that followed. Doesn't say how recently, and we are rectifying them. Believers are Soviet people, workers, patriots, and they all have the full right to express their convictions with dignity. This is especially true of ethics and morals, a domain where universal norms and customs are so helpful in our common cause. Remarkable words from communist leader. And no communist leader before or since not even the Chinese, where religion, where the Christian faith, as you know, is growing by the day. But no communist leader ever in history, except for Gorbachev, has talked about common cause between religion and communism. I wonder what would have happened if Gorbachev had stayed in power. But of course he was to be ousted a couple of years later. As it were, the extrapolation of his words was never followed through. But what he did do was to promise freedom to the church, and freedom particularly for those, for that time, freedom for a very specific event to be celebrated. The year, as I mentioned, was 1988. And again, I think this is God's disposition and intervention in history. That was also the year when the church was due to celebrate, but it didn't know how it was going to do it, to celebrate 1,000 years since the baptism of the Eastern Slavs, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, in 988. 1988. Gorbachev gave the church carte blanche to celebrate the event, the millennium as it's called, however it wished. And church leaders began very shortly. The focus of the events was in June, just a couple of months later. Church leaders began to assemble in Moscow from all over the world. I was lucky enough to be able to be there. And one thing that the first day that I arrived, I could see after 10 years' absence that things had changed totally. Traditional processions carrying icons through the streets were there to greet your eyes as you stepped out onto a central boulevard in Moscow. You turned on the television, which had only 2 channels at that stage, and I remember so well my first evening. Channel 1 was reporting the events of the day and the arrival of the Christian leaders for the celebrations. Channel 2 was transmitting a very complimentary, where they got the information from I don't know, but a very complimentary documentary about the contribution of the Russian Orthodox Church to Russian history and culture. Moscow, Russia, more broadly, had been transformed. There were some undercurrents, one of which is relevant to the present, and that is that Kiev, which had been the focus of the original Russian Christian state, Kievan Rus, Kievan Russia, was more or less edited out of the process. Not the first time and not the last time that the Ukrainians would be insulted by the Russian Orthodox Church and indeed the Soviet state. So the celebrations were amazing, and I can't go through them all, otherwise I would spend the rest of my lecture talking about just that. And I must shortly draw to a close. But you can, if you would like to read more about it, this book may be in the library, Gorbachev, Glasnost and the Gospel. It's got a whole chapter about my experiences in 1988 when I went back to Moscow. The next event, or the culminating event of that week in Moscow, before I went on to other places, was at the Bolshoi Theatre. I had been to church services, open air, June was the month, in the newly refurbished, or being refurbished, headquarters of the Moscow Patriarchate, the Danilov Monastery. That in itself was interesting, because when I was a student in Moscow, I'd walked around the formidable walls of the monastery when I was surveying all the open churches in Moscow, which weren't very many, about 40 altogether. And this was a closed one, closed because those formidable walls encased what was then a children's prison. And this children's prison, by this time, had been transformed very rapidly into the headquarters of the Moscow Patriarchate, attended an open-air service in the grounds, and then on to the end of the great ceremonies. And the culmination was in the Bolshoi Theatre, and all the dignitaries, church and state, assembled for a celebration of church and state. I was sitting in about the fourth row of the stalls. I was overwhelmed by what happened. The local residents, the Bolshoi Orchestra, the Bolshoi Chorus, assembled on stage, but then filed on the men's chorus, the student and monks chorus from the great monastery of the Holy Trinity north of Moscow. And they joined with the Bolshoi theatre chorus in singing Slava, Slava, glory, glory to the Russian state, and I suppose by implication to the Russian church as well. A great cry of freedom, a remarkable, remarkable experience. And as this great event took place, the top of the Bolshoi Theatre opened out right above the stage, and there were church bells up there. I never knew that they were there. A panel opened, and you could actually see the church bells ringing in the new era. I wish that was recorded on television. It went out on television, perhaps somewhere in the state archives in Moscow that exists. I would love to see it again. It was an experience never to be forgotten. This was the new era, inaugurated because of Gorbachev's new policies, and it was something which, an opportunity which obviously the Russian Orthodox Church took with two hands. But, and I emphasize this, it was not well prepared for a new period of freedom. It turned, instead of instituting change from the bottom, there was a new good work being done in the parishes, prison visiting, which couldn't be done before, new educational lectures, Sunday schools, the hospital chaplains, army chaplains, all these very rapidly became reality. But at the same time, the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, began to think in terms of turning the clock back to the glory days being pre-1917, when the Russian Orthodox Church ruled the roost in conjunction with the Tsar. And they began to emphasize the harmony, symphonia, as they called it, between church and state. And I thought back to myself often of the symphonia, literally on stage, and the Bolshoi Theatre, those two choirs, symphonia of church and state. And that has been the watchword ever since. So much so that very regrettably, the Russian Orthodox Church has not been able to examine its own past. Joshua mentioned Archbishop Desmond Tutu. You remember what he did in South Africa. He was he organized, or was one of the co-organizers of the Truth and Reconciliation. I forget the complete name. Commission, that's the name. Such a commission has never happened in Russia. The fact that the Russian Orthodox Church, in the way illustrated by that probably enforced letter from the Patriarch to the Archbishop of Canterbury, this kind of collaboration, enforced collaboration by the church under the iron fist of the state, this has never been properly examined. No Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Russia, and the Russian church suffers very badly from that today. I myself have been a welcome guest many times back in Russia since then. I'm a bit old now to travel in the highways and byways of Russia. It's a huge country. My colleagues, since Keston began different approach, we obviously failed to receive much financial support after the collapse of communism, regrettably. That was the economic situation that we were in. We did what we could. We preserved our archive, which is now at Baylor University, Baptist University in origin, in Texas, and they're doing a wonderful job with it. Joshua has been there. I'm going next week. But in Moscow, in Russia, we have a team, two Russians, Sergei Filatov, the author that many of you will have read, and his colleague who writes about the Protestants, Roman Lunkin. You can find his work there too. They have travelled with selected people from this country, including on occasion myself, throughout the Soviet Union, throughout Russia, documenting the present situation in the far-flung regions, doing it diocese by diocese, region by region, and remarkably filling up 7 volumes of a published encyclopedia on religion in Russia today. And in it you can see that at the lowest level, the Russian church is doing good work in some of the parishes, some social activity, as well as beautiful religious worship, which draws people in, although perhaps not quite so readily as it used to do in communist days, when there was so little colour in the average life of the Russian. But also, we, in that encyclopedia, chart the political attitude of the Russian bishops. And the one thing that they are terrified of is experiment, the call for souls, the conversion. They are afraid of democracy. They're afraid, unnecessarily in my view, of competition from other religions, of other denominations. They were originally terrified of the incursion of missionaries from the United States and elsewhere. Then that passed. Then they were terrified of the power of the Catholics, who introduced very well-educated priests into these country regions. And the bishops of the Orthodox Church have more or less closed ranks, and they continue to shore up the policies of the Moscow Patriarchate. Some of those policies I find deeply hurtful. Here is Metropolitan Hilarion, British educated, Oxford educated, going a couple of weeks ago to America at the invitation of the Billy Graham organization and calling on Billy Graham, his 96th birthday. And he goes, as he has done in this country, telling the American Christians their business. This is what he says. Unfortunately, by the end of the 20th century, the relationship of the Moscow Patriarch with many Christian communities in the USA has encountered a serious crisis. It was caused by the liberalization of the moral teaching in these communities, their deviation from the ethical norms laid down by Holy Scripture of the New Testament common to us all, Thus, in 2003, the Russian Orthodox Church had to suspend contacts with the Episcopal Church in the USA, my own Anglican church, due to the fact that it consecrated an open homosexual as a bishop. At the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church remained open to contact with the North American confessions, which have stayed faithful to the traditions of our dialogue and which are firmly committed to biblical morality, in particular with the Anglican Church of North America. That's what I find particularly hurtful, because the Anglican Church of North America is a tiny minority of the most traditional Christians, and has separated itself from the Episcopal Church because of the above-mentioned incident. Okay, Hilarion on his preaching stool is indicating that the Russian Orthodox Church is the guardian of all morality. Have a look at our article by Sergei Filatov, and he quotes Father Andrei Kurayev, formerly an official of the Russian Orthodox Church, a high official, who incidentally provided me and my wife with the very tickets that we used to get into the Bolshoi Theatre for that occasion I discussed. And this is a quote from Sergei. An important further cause for the growth of opposition to the Russian Orthodox Church has been the exposure of immorality among some Orthodox clergy and the Moscow Patriarchate's inadequate response. Father Andrei Kurayev, who has written about the pressure to commit homosexual acts placed by certain bishops on those under authority, is well known. There has been almost no attempt to deny Kurayev's claims. Instead, the Patriarchate has criticized Kurayev personally. Well, whether we feel sympathy with what Hilarion said or not, and some people may legitimately feel sympathy, but the Russian Orthodox Church also has its problems, and I would far rather that it look towards a solution to those problems rather than travelling abroad, sending representatives abroad to criticize other people's churches. And the same Hilarion, a couple of years ago, and I wrote about this in the Times, was at Lambeth Palace as a guest of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he released a broadside against the Anglican Church on home ground, the Anglican Church's home ground, saying that we as a church support euthanasia, and that is the reason why he couldn't continue relations with us. Well, it is utter and complete nonsense. The Anglican Church does not support euthanasia, but that is what Hilarion said. Despite his Oxford education, incredibly blinkered, and I find that very sad. However, to close on a positive note, I have dedicated my life to the understanding of the Orthodox Church and of the position of other Christians by Christians in the West. And I believe there is still a lot of work to be done in that area. But I also believe that the experience of the persecuted church, their documents, the lives of the martyrs, the Christian witness martyrs, in adverse circumstances, can be an inspiration to the world for the foreseeable future. And I hope that we may, at Keston and elsewhere, continue to promote the truth about what happened and to highlight the voice of the persecuted, because it is a voice which needs to be heard, just as the voice of the appallingly persecuted Christians in the Middle East at the moment needs to be heard by the world. It's being heard far too little from the Middle East, in the way that the voice of Christians in the communist period in Europe was far too little heard as well. We need to do better. Thank you. Well, I've gone 5 minutes over my 45, Jonathan, but we've got some time, I think, left.
No problem at all. Thanks ever so much.
Josh.
Michael, I think the presentation was both challenging and inspiring at the same time, and it's confirmed to me why I find this whole topic, the church in the former Soviet Union, just so fascinating. So I'm sure that your presentation has evoked a lot of questions and responses and comments. So we now have about half an hour or so to put our questions and comments to Michael.
Do you mind if I sit down, Jonathan?
Of course.
Joshua, sorry. Have a bit of relief and pay attention to some water, and we'll be ready to go.
Does anyone have any questions for Michael?
Well, thank you for that. Really interesting. I wonder what the position is of the ascetic and monastic traditions within Russian Orthodoxy now, post-communism. Has there been a revival in that tradition? Is there any scope for such a revival?
The revival goes back to before the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. If you read various works of Russian authors in samizdat that we translated, going back to the 1970s, you will find that there was an increasing interest in monasticism. Dostoevsky, of course, writes about Russian monasticism with great persuasion in The Brothers Karamazov. And that was an inspirational book because it was available even in Stalin's Russia. So monasticism, although it was so heavily persecuted almost out of existence, did continue in the underground. There were what was called wandering monks, monarchi straniki, and female ones as well, nuns, who had no spiritual home because their monasteries, their convents had been closed, but they wandered literally through communist Soviet Union and kept the faith alive by visiting private homes, talking to parents, encouraging parents to have their children baptized, baptizing children, and so on, and carrying out secret marriages. Tremendous amount went on, but this persistence of the monastic tradition began to be celebrated in the 1970s and 80s. There's a lot in the literature, particularly a writer called Anatoly Levitin, whose works are available in some of the books that I wrote. One called Patriarch and Prophets has a whole chapter devoted to Anatoly Levitin. He celebrated the rise in interest and indeed commitment to monasticism among the younger generation. And then after the collapse of communism, it all came out into the open, and the monasteries began to reopen and fill out with neophytes and so on. One particular example that I know personally, and I went there to make a program for the BBC. I was invited, by the way, 7 times by the BBC to do programs about the Russian Orthodox Church. And that resulted in 6 programs back in the from 1999 through the early 2000s, and we were given completely free access. It was an absolutely wonderful period, and everybody trusted everybody else. And I think we made some programs which really did put the revival of monasticism as well as the Orthodox Church in general on the map. The one I'm thinking of in particular was from the monastic islands of Solovki in the north of Russia, in the White Sea, and these the Solovki monastery, the original monastery, had been converted into a prison camp in Lenin's time, back in even before 1920, about 1919, it was turned into a prison camp and was desecrated. The whole thing was terrible ruin. When I first got there in 1993, it had just been returned to the church, but was still a ruin. When I went back 8 years later to make a programme for the BBC, it was already being wonderfully rebuilt, and we recorded the processions of monks around the monastery carrying their icons and singing their praises to God. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I always regretted that the BBC could never find the finance to send a television camera with us. It was all on radio, and it would have been so exciting visually as well as the story. But therein lies encapsulated the revival of monasticism, and many young men went there to Solovki because of their real calling to be monks in an isolated situation where they could contemplate, pray, and develop the life of the monastery as a community. In the Middle Ages and later, the Solovki monastery had been a bastion of culture in the north and had spread its influence throughout hundreds of miles of the Russian Arctic, and now it's beginning to do that again.
It's fascinating you say that. I was struck recently by an article in First Things that said that only 7% of Russians attend church once a month, or even though 50% of members of the Orthodox Church, 2% attend every week. And it reminded me of the conditions that Wesley observed in the 18th century revivals, where he remarked that the death of nominal religion, the discrediting of Christianity by deism, was actually preparing the way for a revival within an established church. And I wonder whether you thought there was potential for a revival in the ascetic tradition to provide a source of renewal for the Russian Orthodox Church.
In a certain sense, the Russian Orthodox Church has missed the boat on a general revival. It was so unprepared for the events of 1988 and 89, which I referred to. It didn't have any real structure. And even now, 25 years later, it hasn't produced the quality of literature that you would hope to find in a church where a revival movement was in place. There have been individual evangelists of great merit and wonderful substance. The most notable, I suppose, was Father Alexander Mien, M-E-N soft sign, Mien. He was a remarkable educator and brought literally thousands of young people to faith in God in the communist period. But he did that very quietly. He never published anything. His sermons were quietly delivered. Most of his evangelistic work was done in the security of his private home. I've sat in his library. One of our radio programs, it was about him, by the way, in 2003. 2005. He was an amazing man, but he was. But by the time I was making this program, he'd been murdered. He was murdered in 1990, obviously by the communist old guard, for whom he was anathema because he was leading the new generation to the faith. I don't think since his death there's been anybody quite like him. In fact, I'm sure there hasn't been. And his name is being more and more used as somebody who can bring young people to the faith. His books are being more and more translated. Originally, they were not accepted by the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church. Why? Because he was ecumenical. He looked for the good in all denominations and indeed in all religions. He had even positive things to say about Islam and Buddhism and so on. And the the Moscow Patriarchate couldn't stand that. So originally they banned his books, more or less. Well, they burnt his books in some places. His books being printed abroad and smuggled back into Russia. That's how they got there originally. But they've come around from that, and now Father Alexander Mien is being seen as one of the great evangelists of the 20th century, a really great man about whom much more needs to be known in the West. You can feel that he is a sort of symbol of the best of the revival. When our team travels around Russia, they go to many monasteries, and the monasteries are one of the focal, and the convents, one of the focal points of the religious revival. But it's a religious revival which does not touch many people. What did you quote? 10% of Russian people, is that what you said?
7% attend once a month, 2% attend every week.
Yes. 2% is probably even an exaggeration. The churches are not full in the way that they used to be full in communist times. But of course that's a dubious statistic because there were so few churches open in communist times, and it's very difficult. I personally don't trust these sociological surveys all that much. What you can say is that even Russian atheists these days, of whom there are quite a number, still have orthodoxy somewhere in their heart. It's kind of part of their genes.
Yeah, I think Pussy Riot actually said when they were prosecuted by the Putin regime, they said that you couldn't venerate an earthly Tsar without remembering the commands of the heavenly Tsar.
Wonderful. I had a section about Pussy Riot in my talk, but I couldn't give it to you because there's just so much to say, so I left it out. But Pussy Riot are very interesting.
It is interesting as well, though, after 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. You mentioned the murder of Alexander Mien. 25 years later, Putin's regime, with a recent clampdown, has resorted again to murdering Orthodox priests who don't toe the line of the church and state. I'm thinking in particular Father Adelheim.
Yes.
Who I believe you knew personally, who was a dissenting voice from the mainstream. And I think it is telling as well that you think about the great flowering, the great era of flourishing of Orthodox theology just, I suppose, prior to the revolution in 1917. We think about people like Sergei Bulgakov, Florovsky, Losky, great scholars with an international reputation. You think about the Orthodox scholarship that's been produced since the collapse of communism. You're struggling to name really anyone of note. The only people that...
Hilarion,
who isn't a scholar at all, who's actually a slave of Putin. You actually mentioned him. I think he's a very nasty piece of work.
Oh, well.
Yeah, absolute. These are the kinds of people who have been produced by the contemporary church. But we don't want to turn this too personal. So let's take a question from Andy.
Thanks for that. It was fascinating. I wrote down, when you mentioned the 1988 moment of Gorbachev being unique in the whole of Soviet history, and I just wrote down, particularly in his own personal experience of life, why, can you identify anything, why for him?
I don't think religion actually stood out as something that he had to make peace with. I think it was human rights in general. He realized that a great resource of Russia, some of its greatest intellectual riches, had been deprived of their power of speech and locked up in prisons, literally, or suppressed. Solzhenitsyn was repressed and exiled, but some of the great writers, other great writers, were imprisoned. And I think particularly of the Jewish protest. There was a huge campaign for the emigration, for the right of Jews to emigrate during the 80s. And in 1970 something, Anatoly Sharansky was imprisoned, and he was a very great man who fought for the rights of the Jews and was imprisoned for 11 years. He was tricked. He was allowed to marry and told that he and his fiancée, he and his new wife could travel to Israel and emigrate. At the airport, he was taken off the plane and imprisoned, and his wife was sent on to Israel, and they never met again for 11 years. Sharansky, in his prison, had a great influence. He deepened his own faith. In fact, he tells a rather charming story of how an imprisoned Orthodox priest taught him more about religious Judaism from the Old Testament than he himself ever knew. Well, why I'm telling this story is this. When Gorbachev got to power, he found everywhere he went, and he liked to travel, there were demonstrations. Free Sharansky, free Sharansky. Sharansky had been in prison for a decade at this point, and Gorbachev absolutely hated being confronted by these demonstrations. They even happened in London when he visited Mrs. Thatcher. And he responded. He freed Sharansky. And that was a kind of symbolical act, but it led to the freedom of literally thousands of prisoners of conscience. This unleashed a kind of intellectual energy back into the community, which I'm absolutely certain, although historians don't give it credence. They all say it was economic, it was to do with communism had run its day. I think, not solely, but to a large extent, the infusion of this intellectual vigor back into society had a massive effect in Gorbachev's Russia, and it was he who opened the prison gates. So I think that explains a great deal of what happened in those days. But again, all that has more or less disappeared from historical knowledge. I talk to Russians sometimes, and even they have forgotten what happened in their own period of history. Gorbachev and what he did is just written out as far as they're concerned. He was the man that destroyed the Soviet Union. That's all they want to know.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was an excellent opening up to us the subject. I'd just like to ask you, after Gorbachev, we had Yeltsin, whom Gorbachev himself called a drunkard, and who seemed to hold the reins of power in a pretty drunk way. Would you like to comment on that period?
Yes.
Eventually came to the fore.
Well, Yeltsin, of course, changed during his time in power. He was, first of all, seen as the very symbol of the new democracy. Remember the picture of him standing on a tank. That was on the occasion that Gorbachev had been, was about to be deposed from power. Gorbachev was on holiday in the Crimea. And the coup took place. And then Yeltsin, who was the party secretary for the Moscow Communist Party, so an very influential man in Moscow, he said, well, this coup is going to be the ruination of the Soviet Union, and he called on the army to lay down their weapons, which from the top of this tank, which they did. And I must say, I admire very much what Yeltsin did in a drunken or sober state over the next few years. He encouraged democracy. And if you look at the history of 1991 and 2 or 3 years afterwards, Russia made very considerable strides towards democracy. I'll give you one example. Every region, Russia was then divided into 89, I'm talking about Russia, not the rest of the Soviet Union. Russia was divided into 89 different regions, and every region was able democratically to elect its own leader. Communist Party didn't properly exist anymore. So this was a local leader who genuinely reflected the needs and aspirations of the very diverse communities in Siberia, in Central Asia, and so on and so on. Those leaders contributed considerably to the development of democratic traditions in their own region. Now, in 2014, all those leaders are appointed by Moscow. That gives an indication of how democracy has been pegged back in those years. Sadly, Yeltsin himself was not able to carry through his reforms, and he became a much weaker man as he went on. And it's alleged, and I think probably correctly, that he actually falsified the ballot in, I forget exactly which year, that led to his re-election, his last period of office. That was really a very sad moment for democracy. He stopped the ball rolling, as it were, and also Russia began economically to descend into chaos, and that gave rise, just as economic chaos gave rise to saw the birth of the mounting support for Hitler in Nazi Germany. So economic chaos and deprivation saw moves towards electing or appointing a stronger leader, and the arrival of Vladimir Putin. So history, in a sense, repeats itself. I'm not saying that Putin is Hitler, but the economic forces in this instance did play some role. Sadly, and this is where I really think, this is the point I might have made more strongly in my lecture, I didn't really make it. I think the Russian Orthodox Church had a moment, even earlier on this year, had a moment when it could have done something decisive. Moral authority still resides in the person of the Patriarch of Moscow, Patriarch Kirill. Because of the great, I consider it disastrous, symphonia between church and state, Patriarch Kirill, like his predecessors, does nothing to criticize the Kremlin leadership. I saw a moment earlier on this year when Patriarch Kirill was the only voice in Russia to whom Putin would have listened, because Putin himself is a believer and would have to listen to the Patriarch. Well, you can see their collusion there. But say if Patriarch Kirill had called on Putin not to intervene in Ukraine, that would have been a great and historic moment. It's probably past. I don't think Kirill is going to do anything like that. But one day, the Moscow Patriarchate is going to have to reform. One day, the Patriarchate, particularly as represented by you heard what Joshua said about Metropolitan Hilarion. One day the Patriarch will be represented by more respected figures, and perhaps a proper dialogue and a proper moral input of the very strong Russian Orthodox Church into the world community might begin again.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that this great figure of moral Spurgeons used to have a very different kind of ministry in the Soviet times.
Oh, I can tell you about that.
He was a KGB spy, responsible for the persecution of believers, particularly against Baptist communities. So this great figure of authority might not be all that he seems, and I suppose it's almost unrealistic to expect that someone like that would raise a voice of prophetic protest against Putin, whose interests he serves. We have another question.
Well, he has a background. Can I just comment on that? He has a background firmly embedded in the KGB. We don't know that he actively denounced his own priests when he was a bishop, but certainly what you said about his criticism of minorities like the Baptists, that is certainly true, and it's on his record. At the same time, positively, he made great waves in Moscow in Leningrad, in promoting religious education during the communist period. So the communists couldn't stand that. He went above the mark. So they shipped him off where? To Smolensk. They couldn't imprison the man as eminent as that. So he went to Smolensk, out of the direct view, as it were, of the Kremlin, and he did tremendous work there in building up the Russian Orthodox Church. And I saw this with my own eyes, because the first of those BBC programs that I did was in Smolensk at his invitation, and he opened every door, and I was very impressed. And if you forget the dark side, he was also an impressive personality and good company and a good host. I ate at his table with my BBC producer, but I had thought for a moment that he might reform the patriarchate when he was elected patriarch. He, by the way, lobbied to become patriarch, and in the Orthodox tradition, that immediately disqualifies you unless you are Patriarch of Moscow, in which case you can. So a very dubious figure all the way round. But there are some positive points.
Thank you for what you shared. Forgive my ignorance, I don't know much about the Russian Orthodox Church, but something that struck me in your last couple of comments, which really struck me as I read the article yesterday. You're talking about history repeating itself, you're talking about the need for an eventual reformation. It struck me as I read it, particularly the quashing of the protests, the forcing of church members to toe the leadership line, the relationship with the state, the real nominalism that people say that culturally orthodox rather than religiously orthodox, and then particularly tying that to this great moment in 88 where almost unexpectedly it's so rapidly changed and the church hasn't really dealt with that. It struck me hugely that these are all the seeds that came to European Reformation in the 1600s.
Yeah.
All the same signs are there, all the same causes are there. And I wondered, do you think, and how long away would be a Reformation movement in the Russian Orthodox Church? Or are the people just too suppressed for that to happen in the near future? Do you foresee a Reformation in the church, and where would it come from?
Very interesting question. I think you can look at it in two different ways. Can you see any seeds of Reformation within the Orthodox Church? That's one. Can you see outside the Church a very active Protestant Reformation in Russia? Let us not disregard the activities of the Russian Protestants, particularly the Baptists, who held up their heads in a quite remarkable way during all those decades of persecution, and which I wrote about extensively, and new information about them is still coming to the fore. I can show you a book I'm reviewing at the moment. It's just been... It came off. It's just been published in the United States. It's called The Gospel in Bonds. It will be available here. My review of it is going to be in the Journal of Ecclesiastical History, but that they work very slowly. It is good for the Russian Orthodox Church to see the experience of lively proclamation of the gospel openly and publicly, which Protestant Church can now do with some restraints, but nothing like the persecution that prevailed in communist times. Not only the Russian Baptists, but the Lutherans, Pentecostals, there is a very considerable revival of Protestantism going on in Russia at this moment. And our Moscow team that I referred to, that have been producing the encyclopedia, they are convinced that when you get west of the Urals, in other words, out of the historic homeland of Russia into Siberia, actually both Catholics and Protestants are stronger than the Russian Orthodox Church, which actually reached the Siberian people relatively late in history anyway. So there are possibly two kinds of Reformation. One, I think that one is going on now, to some extent. The seeds of Reformation, which I saw in the Orthodox Church through the samizdat of these wonderful people writing in the 70s and the 80s, alas, that has more or less, those seeds have not germinated. They did for a short time, or it seemed as if they were going to, but the young plants have, as it were, faded. And I think we have to wait some time before there will be a reformation in the sense that you outlined it in the Russian Orthodox Church. I think it will come because Russians are an educated people. They're not going to put up indefinitely, and I'm talking about believers, your 10% or whatever you like to say, call them. They're not going to put up indefinitely with a church that just mouths assent to everything that their Kremlin leadership talks about. But the Russian church is very slow-moving, very conservative. You cannot change things. There's even an argument which has died about using the Russian language in the liturgy. Look at the way the Roman Catholic Church changed its liturgy after Vatican II in the early 1960s. And wherever you go in the world today, you will find the Catholic Church using indigenous languages. In Russia, there are all these vast new Russian churches which have been built all over the place, still still worship God in a medieval language which is only partly understanded of the people in the famous phrase. You can, with education, and I can, understand Old Church Slavonic, but young priests who wanted to introduce Russian as the language of the modern Russian liturgy have been suppressed, and that movement has more or less died out. The Russian Orthodox Church abroad is able to use language. So if you go to the Russian Orthodox Church in London here, you can hear the liturgy in English, but you cannot hear the liturgy in Russian in Russia. And that is one place where it's going to start. I almost said proclamation of the gospel. The sermons occupy a relatively minor place in the Russian Orthodox tradition, and they are in Russian and not in not in Old Church Slavonic.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure that's an answer to your question, but it's a very difficult one.
I suppose I'm still hoping, praying, waiting, expecting something like a Ukrainian Maidan to take place on the Red Square.
Yes.
That would be a good thing. But anyway, on that note of hope, we'll have to leave it there. That's all we have time for. But thank you ever so much to Michael for his presentation.